Welcome back to our video series, What We Cannot See. We are going to be exploring God versus the gods as we leave the book of Genesis and enter into the rest of the Old Testament. Hopefully we will be able to quickly move through some major points in the Old Testament at where we discover what the Bible has to say about the spiritual beings that we cannot see but that are very much a part of our world. And the whole of the Old Testament, after the Tower of Babel and after the book of Genesis, becomes a story of God versus the gods. God, the creator God, Yahweh, in conflict along with his people, the Jewish people, the Israelites, he is in conflict with the other spiritual beings which have taken control of the rest of the world. And God has allowed them to do that because of the rebellion of the nations. But he is still God, and when he comes toe-to-toe with them, they are going to lose every time. A great example, of course, is when we get to the Exodus. So we have the children of Israel. They're in the nation of Egypt. They've been there for a long time, and they are now an enslaved people. They are a people who have been caught in the yoke of slavery that always follows sin, but they've been caught in the yoke of slavery to Egypt, and they're suffering under the Egyptian slave masters. And Moses, the deliverer, is born, and God raises him up and sends him to Pharaoh and says, "Tell Pharaoh to let my people go." And we see something happen here, something really interesting and something that you may not have looked at this way before. God begins to show the nation of Israel, God begins to show the nation of Israel that he is greater than even the gods of Egypt, which was the greatest, the most powerful nation on the planet at this time. So God is flying in the face of even the gods of Egypt. And we see as God says, "Let my people go," God makes this declaration around Pharaoh. He says, "I am going to show the earth my glory. I am going to show myself as stronger than, more mighty than the true God of humanity, higher and greater than the gods of the most powerful nation on the planet." And God does that. And we see Pharaoh keeps saying, "No, no, no." He won't let the people go. So God sends 10 plagues. Now, these 10 plagues that get sent, they are not just random plagues. It's not just mean things that God thinks up to do to make Pharaoh let his people go. No, these 10 plagues are specifically targeted at the chief gods of the Egyptian pantheon. And we know that for several reasons. We know that because each of them has to do with, it is connected in some way with one of the chief gods of the Egyptian pantheon. But number two, God specifically says it when it comes to the final plague in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. God says this, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." That's what it says. God says, "I will execute judgment on the gods of Egypt." He's declaring who he is and that he's more powerful than these false gods that the Egyptians have worshipped. I'm going to pull up this little infographic, and I will add this as a link to the description of the video. So if you want to take a closer look at it, you can. But here are listed all the 10 plagues that take place: water into blood, the frogs, gnats and lice, flies, the sick cattle, the boils, the hail, the plague and the locust plague, the plague of darkness, and then finally the plague of the firstborn. Each of these was pointed directly at one of the gods, the chief gods of Egypt. Let's take, for instance, the plague of darkness, which is pointed directly at Ra, the sun god, the chief god of the Egyptians. He was supposed to be the most powerful of the gods, and the pharaohs themselves claimed to be the descendants of Ra, the chief god of the Egyptians, and yet he cannot stop Yahweh from blackening the sun and keeping and there being no light whatsoever in the land. God was revealing the Egyptian gods, small g, as weak and powerless, but not only that, he was revealing them as cruel and despotic. Okay, so here's what I mean by that. What God was doing when we read in Exodus chapter 12, at the end of chapter 12, about the plague of the firstborn, we see where the firstborn children of the nation of Egypt are killed, both the human and the animal firstborn. We see that it says that God, the destroyer angel, the angel of death, we actually hear more about him in the book of Revelation later on, is sent in to do this job. He is allowed to come. And we know who God is. He was perfectly revealed in Jesus. God is not the killer of babies. Can I just proclaim that right now? Our God is not the killer of babies. God did not kill these Egyptian children. But what God did do was allow the God of death, the God of destruction that is worshipped by these Egyptians, to have his way, to come in and to do what he wanted to do. And God limited the destruction to the firstborn of Egypt. He limited the destruction to just a relatively small number of children, but he did allow that God to have his way. And if you look through all of these other plagues, like the plague of frogs, for instance, well, there's frogs everywhere. Well, the one Egyptian frog, or Egyptian god, Hecht, was an Egyptian goddess, and she had the head of a frog, and she was related to the Nile, etc. And so here come all these frogs. Well, God is allowing that Egyptian God, that spiritual being, to do what it wants to do. He's removing the restraints. He's taken his protective hand off of the people of Egypt so that they can see that if God really gave them over to these beings that they have chosen to worship, that they would not be protected, that they would be destroyed, because that's all that these ancient Egyptian gods wanted to do. It is a fearful thing to be out from under the protection of the living God. There's really so much more to the Exodus story that is interesting to think about and to ponder when it comes to the spiritual side, the invisible side of the Exodus. But let's move forward and let's talk about Israel's entrance into the land of the promised land. You know, they walk through the wilderness. By the way, oh man, there's so many things we're fast forwarding past. So many things that we could think about. So many things we could talk about. What is the angel that goes before them? There's an angel that goes before them, and there are bees that go before them to drive the people out of the land. Just fascinating things to think about, to see. Was the pillar of fire seems to have been the angel of the Lord that went before the people of Israel. But I want to talk about when they get to the land, because then we run into some people that we talked about in the last video. You got it right. Nephilim. Here we go. They're smack back into dealing with the Nephilim again. And here's the thing. Now Israel has become God's agents to root out the Nephilim problem. But here's my other question. Why are there Nephilim there? You know, we think about the flood really was supposed to take care of the Nephilim problem. We don't know if the Nephilim survived, or we're not sure how they got there, but we know that the Bible tells us that they were there, and God commands the Israelites to destroy the towns and the tribes that were connected with the Nephilim. But why were they there? Why were they in Israel, of all places? Well, if we go with our working theory, which is that Satan is doing everything he can to stop the coming of Messiah, then it would make sense that he would go in front of the children of Abraham into the promised land and plant some Nephilim seed there to try once again to stop God's plan to crush the serpent's head, right? Doesn't it make sense that God would send, would do that? Not God, Satan, that Satan would send agents there to do again what he tried to do before and raise up a people that would stand in opposition against the promise of God. So they are there, and there is a problem. The spies go in. Remember the story about the 12 spies that are sent in. And all the spies coming back saying the same thing. There's Nephilim. There's giants. We look like grasshoppers next to them. They look like these tiny little beings. How in the world are we going to win? And of course, Joshua and Caleb, Joshua's got a great name. Joshua and Caleb come back and they're like, nah, God can handle it. No big deal. Let's get in there. Let's see. Let's do what we're going to do. And then you see later Caleb in his 80s. He's an old man, but he's like, give me the hill country. And that is where the primary place of the Nephilim was. And Caleb said he wanted to go personally, to go and see the victory that God was going to bring for his people. The land that they went. I'm going to read from Numbers chapter 13 now, where it talks specifically about the Nephilim. The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. That's Numbers 13, 32, and 33. Okay, so they've encountered these big people. There's this new name that we haven't heard before, Anak, who apparently was a Nephilim, and then his kids, the sons of Anak, who are descendants of Anak, who is a Nephilim. Okay, so, and they're giants in the land. Deuteronomy chapter 3, Moses runs into a very famous Nephilim. His name is Og. What a great name, Og. But he wasn't a great guy, and he was the king of Bashan, and he was defeated by the Israelites, and he is mentioned as both a giant, and here's another word, Rephaim. Okay, so here's the verse. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. So we have a mention of Og's bed so that we have some idea of just how big Og actually was. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 3. And the writers of the book, whenever this book was written, are saying, you can still go see his bed. It's this giant bed that is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Now, a cubit was somewhere between 18 and 20 inches. So do the math. We're looking at a bed that was 13 feet long or so and about 6 feet wide, which it's not that wide, but it was really long. Why? Because the man who slept in it was ginormous. He was, approaching 13 feet, apparently. I mean, you don't want a bed that's going to be too much longer than you. And this bed was approaching 13 feet long. It was also made of iron. I don't know how comfortable a bed made of iron is, but it survived him so that they could point back and say, guys, you know how big that bed is. That was Og's bed, and that's how big he was. And there's these other names that we need to pay a little bit of attention to. Okay, so Bashan, the Rephaim. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah. and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Wait for it. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Joshua 11:22 through and 23. So, Joshua came through and wiped out the cities of the Nephilim, wiped out the Anakim. Anakim is just Anak pluralized, and that means the children of Anak. These are his kids. This Nephilim named Anak that we don't really know much about, but there he is. And he had established these cities. His families had established these cities, were full of giants, full of this interbreeding between humans and spiritual beings. And there they are over there, and Joshua wiped them out of those towns that are mentioned, except in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. Okay, so Gath and Ashdod became Philistine cities, and they left some of the giants there. They didn't take them out. Well, guess where Goliath was from? Gath. Hello. We can see that still, even in the time of David, hundreds of years later, we're still dealing with this problem. So just remember those names when you run across them in the Bible: Nephilim, Anak, Anakim. Bashan is a big one. We'll talk about the bulls of Bashan later on in when we talk about Jesus. And the Rephaim, which Rephaim is just a general term for all the tribes who had Nephilim or giant blood in them, and they were assigned to be utterly destroyed. By the way, these are the only tribes that God told Israel he was supposed to utterly destroy. We have some issues with, I have some issues with serving a God that is for genocide of any kind or description. Well, if we are rooting out this infiltration of demonic beings, and God is, for that reason, God says, destroy them all. Well, that is a little bit different than if this is just a tribe that they didn't like Israelites. No, that's not what's going on. God assigned them to destruction because they were of the Nephilim. So you can see that this is a very real, very powerful thing that's going on. Now, we're going to leave the kind of earthly scene for a minute, and we're going to look at two places, maybe, well, a few more places in the Old Testament where we get a view of the council scene. Okay, so that is the scene in the heavens where God is seated with his divine council, with these spiritual beings that are conferring with him and talking with him and operating with him, and how that whole thing works. So we're just going to look at a few other places where the Bible brings those up. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Lord knows I've already spent a lot of time, but let's go in the book of Job. In Job chapter 1, verse 6, we are invited into this council meeting. Now, Job is not necessarily a historical book, but it doesn't matter. This is still the picture that we think about. It's still something that we see. And this is the way that the Hebrew writers would have thought about this divine council, these supernatural beings that are ruling, that are over the nations of the earth, and that God visits and speaks to and deals with that council. Job chapter 1, 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God, there's that phrase again, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. That's a really fascinating Bible verse right there. It's a really fascinating thing to see, because here we have this picture of the sons of God, those that have been set to rule over the earth, and have taken up positions of authority over the earth, seated with God, and they're coming before the Lord, and they're presenting themselves before the Lord, and God, the ruler of all things, is sitting there in rulership over them. But then Satan comes in among them, and you know what Satan does, and then Job's life gets pretty rough after that. But we won't talk anymore about that. Okay, so now let's take a look at, there's another council scene much further forward in the history of Israel, and that's in 2 Chronicles. We have another council scene that I would like to take a look at. So 2 Chronicles chapter 18, starting with verse 18. Micaiah continued. So a little bit of backstory. I'm sorry, before we read the verse. A little bit of backstory. What we have is we have the king of Judah. That's the faithful part. This is already after Judah and Israel have split up. Ahab is the king of Israel, bad guy, and we have the king of Judah, the faithful king, who is coming, and they're going to fight together against their enemy. I'm trying to remember which enemy it is, and I didn't write it down. Doesn't matter. I think it's Syria. So they're going to fight against their common enemy, and they're going to fight together. And the king of Judah goes to Ahab's court, and he said, and they are working together. And they said, well, before we do this, let's ask of the Lord, of course, because he's the faithful king. And he's like, look, can we pray about this? Can we ask of the Lord? Are there some prophets around that can tell us what the Lord is trying to say? And all these different prophets from Israel come forward, all of them coming forward. Oh, God's going to give you victory. God's going to give you victory. God's going to give you victory, over and over and over again. Here they come. God's going to give you victory. And they keep hearing the same thing. And the king of Judah is like, don't you have a prophet of Yahweh around? I love that. He's like, he recognizes them right away. These aren't the real dudes. These guys don't have the connection. And Ahab like, well, yeah, there's this guy, Micaiah. I don't like him. He never prophesies anything good for me. So I don't listen to that guy. He's a bummer. So forget him. Let's not talk to him. Well, the king of Judah says, no. We're going to have a conversation with Micaiah. Where is he? So here comes Micaiah. And at first, Micaiah is like, oh, you're going to win. Oh, whatever. And biblically, you can kind of tell he's being sarcastic. Oh, don't worry about it. Go on up. Really? Just go for it. Go ahead. And the king of Judah says, prophesy faithfully. Tell us what the word of the Lord is. Micaiah says, therefore hear the word of the Lord. And he tells him, yeah, Ahab's going to die. That's what's going to happen if you go and fight. So you just need to know that. That's what's about to take place. Ahab is going to be killed. And this is what he says. He says this weird thing. Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, king of Israel, to march up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one suggested this and another that, and then a spirit came forward, stood before the Lord and said, I will entice him. And the Lord says, by what means? Asked the Lord. And he replied, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouths of all his prophets. You will surely entice him and prevail, says the Lord. Go and do it. Whoa. So one of these spirits, one of the sons of God, says, I'll go and I'll lie to all his prophets and tell them that they're gonna win. That's what I'll do. I'll go lie to them all. They're not really prophets of Yahweh anyway. They won't know the difference between your speaking and my speaking, and I'll go and I'll lie to them all and tell them you're gonna win. So then he'll believe him and they'll go. And God says, go ahead, do that. These beings have something to do with what happens on the earth. This is real earthly, real, true earthly impact in what's going on with these spiritual beings. True earthly impact is going on. No cheese for me. These spiritual beings actually have something to do with what happens in the affairs of men. That's why we're talking about this. If they were just off in the spirit realm, just doing whatever they're going to do, and they had nothing to do with us, then I would not be having this conversation. I would not be interested in making this video. But they do. Then and now. And I promise you, we're going to get to now. Because now is different than then, because Jesus has come, Jesus has become a man, and the King of all kings is now dethroning the powers and authorities. But you're going to have to wait until we get there. Okay. Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel sees these living creatures, and Isaiah calls them seraphim. Isaiah saw them as well, flying in the midst of the throne room of God. They are burning beings. And the one carries the coal and cleanses Isaiah's lips. Ezekiel sees them, and he says, and he talks about them as being these beings that are a part of the throne of God that move, and the wheels and the etc. That's Ezekiel. But Daniel, now we have some interesting stuff in Daniel. Daniel has definitely some interesting stuff to think about. Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream when a watcher, a holy one, came down and judged him. Nebuchadnezzar is an evil king. He is a prefiguring of Antichrist. And he, in his pride, he says that he's the one that's lifted up Babylon. And the watchers, one of these sons of God, judge him for that, and he goes through a period of 7 years of craziness because of the judgment of the spiritual one. But my favorite divine council verses in the whole of the Old Testament are from Daniel 10, Daniel 9, which this is what launched me doing this whole video, was that I was preaching a sermon on Daniel 10. Okay. And that may be why you're watching this video right now, but I was preaching a sermon on Daniel 10. And in Daniel 10, he talks about the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece. In Daniel 9, Daniel has been praying about the future of the people of Israel. Daniel asks the Lord to show him how God is going to keep his promise of setting his people free after the period of exile that they are in the midst of. And God sends him a vision, and of he goes beyond just the period of the exile. The vision that Daniel gets from Gabriel actually shows him the entire future of the Jewish people, all the way out to the end, and all the way through Messiah and everything else. But Daniel doesn't understand the vision when he first sees it. So he begins to pray. And here's where we're coming up on it. You see, our prayer affects what happens in the heavenly realms. Our prayer moves spiritual authorities. Our prayer sets the kingdom of God loose on the earth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So in Daniel 10, Daniel begins to pray, and he fasts for 21 days. And Gabriel comes to Daniel, and he says to Daniel, Daniel 10, verse 2, "In those days I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 full weeks. I ate no rich food, nor meat or wine entered my mouth, and I did not anoint myself with oil until the 3 weeks were completed." Okay, so Daniel fasts for 21 days. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit. We're going to get to verse 12, because this is where we get a little bit of information on the divine council once again, these invisible beings once again, and what's going on in the realms that we cannot see. Daniel 10, verse 12, "Do not be afraid, Daniel," he said, For from the first day that you proposed to understand and to humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. So God was answering Daniel's prayer right from day one. But look what happens, verse 13. However, the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. Verse 14, now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision concerns those days. Wow, look at what's going on here. We get a glimpse of true spiritual warfare. And by that, I don't mean somebody standing and yelling on a microphone. By that, I mean warfare going on in the spirit realms. Gabriel, the very messenger of God, comes to deliver a message to Daniel, and he can't get through. Gabriel, who tells us in the New Testament that he sees the very face of God. This mighty angel, and in this case, that's exactly the right word, because angel means messenger. This mighty angel Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, is stopped by the authority of the Prince of Persia. The Prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. That whole time that Daniel was praying, the problem wasn't with God. The problem was with the Prince of Persia, this supernatural being who was holding back the answer to Daniel's prayer and not allowing Gabriel to move through. But God heard Gabriel's prayer and sent Michael, yet another supernatural prince. This word prince just means authority figure. Yet another supernatural being to come and to hold back the forces of the king of the Prince of Persia, so that Gabriel could get through and could explain the vision to Daniel. But we're not done, because this is crazy. All right? The Prince of Persia, this supernatural being, which is over the kingdom of Persia, which is where Daniel was, he had every legal right to hold Gabriel back, by the way, because Persia was his. Gabriel was God's, and Daniel was God's, but Persia belongs to this spiritual being. God gave him the authority over it back at the Tower of Babel, way back. But here they are again, and Michael comes, and Michael is the angel over the children of Israel. So he's God's friend who is working with God to fight for the children of Israel. That's who Michael is. It's unbelievable to me. Now, why we don't get the name of the Prince of Persia, I don't know. Maybe because we don't want it. I don't. Why don't we? But we don't even stop there, because here's what happens: when Michael comes and he opposes the Prince of Persia, a fight begins. Okay, and at the end of verse 20, we see this. Gabriel says, after he's explained the vision to Daniel, Gabriel says to him, "I must return at once to fight against the Prince of Persia, and when I have gone forth, behold, the Prince of Greece will come." Okay, so what? What just happened? What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. Okay? The Prince of Persia, this supernatural being which is standing as the ruler of the nation of Persia at that time, the supernatural ruler, the force behind the throne of Persia, okay, is standing there and is opposing Gabriel from coming in. Michael comes and joins with Gabriel, and together they fight. Maybe there were others too, we don't really know. Together they fight against the Prince of Persia, and Gabriel knows that he's going to be defeated. And when he is defeated, there will be a power vacuum, and the Prince of Greece will come. And if you know your history, then you know this. Here comes, out of nowhere, Persia was fighting against Greece. Persia went over and fought against Greece, and the whole world expected Greece to lose, but Greece won and fought off the Prince of Persia. And not only that, but a while later, Greece actually goes over and defeats, in the form of Alexander the Great, goes over and defeats Persia and wipes it off the map. Okay, so we see how the spiritual warfare that's going on actually affects earthly politics and earthly things that are going on. And more than that, we see 21 days of fasting by a man who is a friend of God shift the geopolitical atmosphere of the entire planet. Can you imagine that? That is unbelievable. And that is really why I wanted to do this study with you. I want you to be aware, not only that these spiritual beings are out there, that's fascinating, but I want you to also to be aware that you and I, my friends, you and I are a part of the spiritual battle, because you and I have been invited to the divine council. And you and I are to be our calling, and the reason we were created is to rule with Christ. Well, what does that look like? We will sit on the heavenly council with God and with the angels, and we will walk before. In fact, the Apostle Paul says, do you not know that you will judge angels? But we are getting way ahead of ourselves. So we're going to stop there for this video with that thought. The prayers of Daniel shifted the heavenly atmosphere, and when the heavenly atmosphere was shifted, the earthly atmosphere was changed. In fact, the greatest empire in the world at that time was uprooted and removed by the prayers of one man prevailing upon the atmosphere of heaven. Think about that. And we will come back next time. We're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about the New Testament, and we're going to talk about our authority and what it looks like, my friends, for us to do warfare in the spiritual realm. It's going to be awesome. Join me.